The lilies were still fresh. Their scent lingered in the parlor, blending with the faint trace of candle wax and cold coffee. Outside, the autumn wind of Vermont whispered against the windows, stirring the black drapes that framed the Holloway estate like mourning veils. 2 hours had passed since the funeral, yet the silence inside the house felt heavier than the one in the graveyard. If you are watching this, subscribe and let me know where you are watching from. Margaret Holloway sat very still in her late husband's armchair, the one she had chosen for him on their 30th anniversary. The velvet was worn where his elbows used to rest, and the wood still carried the faint polish of his hands. Around her, guests murmured, clinking glasses of champagne instead of holding tissues. Someone turned on soft jazz in the background, as if grief could be muted with the right soundtrack. She was still wearing black. Her hands trembled slightly, not from age, but from restraint. She could feel the heat of her son's words before they even left his mouth. Daniel stood near the fireplace, tall, confident, the same sharp jaw as his father, but without the kindness in his eyes. His wife, Clarissa, whispered something and handed him a glass of scotch. He raised it, his tone casual and cold. "Don't expect a dime from Dad's 84 million, Mother. You've had enough." The room froze. No one moved, no one breathed. Even the jazz faltered, as if the record itself had flinched. Margaret looked up. Her son did not. He was studying the flames, smirking slightly, like a man proud of delivering a punchline. She placed her teacup down gently, though her knuckles had turned white. The liquid rippled once before settling. For a long moment, she said nothing. The silence wrapped around her like the black veil she still wore. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, so calm it frightened even the air. "Is that what he taught you to say at funerals, Daniel?" He didn't answer. Clarissa laughed softly, a sound too sweet to be sincere. "Oh, Mom," she said, swirling her drink. "We're just trying to be practical. You'll be comfortable here, of course, until everything is sorted." "Sorted," Margaret repeated. The word tasted like dust in her mouth. Across the room, her grandchildren were laughing. Sophie was tapping at her phone, snapping pictures of the grand piano. Ben, the younger one, had discovered the old grandfather clock and stuck a neon sticker to its face. "This one's mine," he said. The sticker glowed in the golden light like a wound. Margaret's gaze traveled to the silver-framed photograph above the mantel, their wedding day. She and Richard, smiling beneath the oak tree he had planted behind the house, his arm around her waist, her hand resting lightly on his chest. The image shimmered faintly, catching the flicker of the candles. Now that same chest lay still under the ground behind St. Paul's Church, the soil still fresh, the lilies still wet from morning rain. "Dad would want us to celebrate," Daniel said, breaking her thoughts. "He built something extraordinary, and now it's time we carry it forward." He lifted his glass. "To legacy." The others repeated it. "To legacy." Margaret remained seated. Her throat ached with something too old to name. She remembered the nights Richard had worked by that same fireplace, surrounded by papers and worry. She remembered the smell of his coffee, the low hum of the old lamp, the sound of her pen scratching across documents while he dictated ideas that came from her more than from him. But that was a lifetime ago. Now, they celebrated without him and without her. She stood slowly, the chair creaking beneath her. "Legacy," she said softly. "Yes. He built one." Daniel glanced at her then, half irritated. "Mother, please. Let's not make this dramatic." Margaret's lips trembled, but not from weakness. The tremor was anger, buried under layers of grace. "I buried my husband this morning, Daniel. You buried your decency with him." The room went utterly still. Clarissa shifted in her heels, feigning a laugh. "Mom, really? We're all grieving in our own way." "Are you?" Margaret asked. "Because I can't tell where grief ends and greed begins." No one spoke after that. The only sound was the faint ticking of the clock Ben had claimed, its hands moving with cruel precision. Mary, the old housekeeper, appeared in the doorway then. She had worked for the family since Daniel was born, and her eyes carried the kind of sorrow that knew too much. She hesitated, glancing at Margaret, then at the empty glass in Daniel's hand. "Would you like me to make you some tea, Mrs. Holloway?" Margaret nodded faintly. "Yes, please, Mary, and make one for yourself." Clarissa's lips tightened. "Mary, there's no need." "We have champagne." Mary ignored her. She disappeared quietly into the kitchen. Margaret walked to the window. The sun had begun to set behind the Vermont hills, painting the sky in strokes of amber and violet. The roses outside were bowing under the weight of dew. Richard had planted them for her on their 20th anniversary, promising they would outlive them both. She whispered under her breath, "You were wrong, love. They are dying already." Behind her, laughter resumed. The sound of glasses, the rustle of paper, the low hum of greed disguised as family conversation. She felt herself shrinking, disappearing, becoming what they wanted her to be: background, furniture, an afterthought. Mary returned with 2 cups of tea, one for Margaret, one for herself. She placed them gently on the side table. "I'm sorry for what he said, ma'am," she whispered. Margaret's eyes softened. "Don't be. Words only hurt when you still expect kindness." From the corner of her vision, Margaret noticed something: Daniel slipping a stack of envelopes into his briefcase. The family lawyer's crest stamped in gold. The will. It was happening faster than she had imagined. She pressed her hand to the locket at her neck, the same one she had worn for 40 years. Inside was a faded photograph of Richard holding Daniel as a child. His eyes then had been full of trust. She wondered when that light had gone out. Mary leaned closer. "Do you want me to stay tonight?" "No," Margaret said. "They need someone to see them clearly. I'll do that myself." She took a slow breath, tasting the smoke from the fireplace. Somewhere deep inside, the ache of humiliation turned into something sharper: resolve. The candles flickered as if stirred by unseen wind. Margaret turned toward the family gathered around the piano, dividing up furniture and future as though she had already left this world. She reached for her teacup again. Her reflection in the dark liquid was calm, but her eyes carried a quiet storm. "They think I'm finished," she thought, "but I've only just begun." The clock chimed 7, the first chime of her awakening. If this story has already touched your heart, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to Grandma's Final Chapter, and share where you are watching from. Every day, we tell stories that remind seniors and their families that age is not the end of purpose. It is the beginning of truth, dignity, and the courage to live freely once more. The morning after the funeral arrived with a strange kind of brightness, the kind that felt wrong. The Holloway estate sat under a crisp Vermont sky, sunlight spilling through the tall windows as if unaware of what had just been buried beneath it. The air should have smelled of silence and grief, yet it was filled with laughter, footsteps, and the scrape of chairs against polished floors. Margaret stood at the top of the staircase, fingers resting on the banister Richard had polished himself every spring. From below came the sound of drawers being pulled open and voices calling across the rooms. It was not mourning, it was inventory. Sophie's voice rose first. "Look at this rocking chair. Grandma used to sit here every evening. I'm taking it for my apartment. It'll look vintage." She peeled a pink sticky note and pressed it onto the armrest. On it, in neat cursive, was one word: mine. Margaret's eyes lingered on that small square of paper. The sunlight hit it directly, and for a brief second it glowed, a bright scar against the worn mahogany. Ben, the younger one, was holding his phone up to the wall. "This painting could sell for a few thousand," he said, snapping a photo. "We'll list it online. Grandma doesn't even remember who painted it." He laughed. Sophie laughed with him. Margaret descended the stairs slowly. Each step creaked with the sound of years, and with every sound she felt another layer of her home being peeled away. When she reached the landing, the voices softened for a moment before swelling again, louder this time. Daniel stood near the doorway to the study, sleeves rolled up, clipboard in hand. "The master bedroom's mine," he said, his tone brisk and managerial. "Mother can move downstairs. It's more practical, easier for her at her age." Clarissa nodded approvingly. "I was thinking we could turn your old room into a guest suite, Margaret. Maybe repaint the walls. Something light, cheerful." Margaret looked around the room she had lived in for nearly half a century. Every corner had a story. The piano she had played when Daniel was a boy, the lace curtains she had sewn by hand, the china cabinet filled with wedding gifts now covered in neon paper claiming ownership. Each note was a declaration. Mine, ours, take this one. The house was turning into a map of conquest. She wanted to speak, but the words caught in her throat. It was not anger that silenced her, but disbelief. Mary appeared quietly in the doorway, still wearing her apron, her eyes red from tears she had tried to hide. "Ma'am," she said softly, "do you want me to start packing your things?" Margaret turned to her, the gentleness in Mary's voice cutting through the noise like a hymn. She smiled faintly. "Not yet, dear." Daniel's tone sharpened. "Mary, you can help Clarissa sort the kitchen later. We'll be taking some of the silver to the lake house." Mary nodded, but her hands were trembling. She glanced at Margaret, but Margaret gave no sign. Clarissa walked past, trailing perfume and purpose. "Ben, make sure you label the boxes, and please take down those awful curtains. They're ancient." "They were my mother's," Margaret said quietly. Clarissa paused, then smiled the kind of smile that hid contempt beneath courtesy. All the more reason to start fresh. The scissors made a soft hiss as they sliced through the lace. The sunlight came in harsher after that, unfiltered and cold. Margaret moved to the corner where the family portrait once hung. The wall was bare now, only a faint outline left behind. Sophie had taken the frame an hour earlier, promising to repurpose it. Ben dragged an empty suitcase across the floor, the zipper teeth clattering. "Do we keep the old records? Dad said most of them are from the 70s. Daniel waved his hand dismissively. "Toss them, unless someone wants them for nostalgia." Margaret walked to the piano. Her fingers traced the keys, ivory dulled by time. She pressed one. A low note filled the air, trembling slightly, as if the instrument itself hesitated to be heard in this new world. Her voice was quiet when she spoke. "Your father loved that song." Ben looked up from his phone. "Which one?" She smiled. "All of them." No one replied. Clarissa started measuring the living room walls with a phone app. "We could open this space up," she said to Sophie. "Make it brighter. Maybe a wine bar here. Better lighting for parties." Sophie nodded. "Spa corner upstairs, wine bar downstairs. It'll look amazing." They were designing a life that had no place for her. Mary approached again, holding a small velvet box. "Ma'am, I found this in the drawer. Should I set it aside?" Margaret opened it. Inside lay her wedding ring, the one she had stopped wearing after Richard's hands grew too cold to hold it. She closed the lid gently. "Keep it safe, Mary. For now." Mary hesitated. "They don't see you, ma'am. They only see what's left to take." Margaret touched her arm lightly. "That's all right. Let them take. They can't touch what they don't understand." Clarissa called from the hallway. "Mary, could you bring us more labels?" "Yes, Mrs. Holloway," Mary replied softly, her eyes never leaving Margaret's face. The noise resumed. Laughter, the sound of sticky notes peeling from their pads, the hollow echo of footsteps on wood. Each sound felt like a nail sealing away another memory. Margaret sat down at the bottom of the stairs, where the morning light fell in narrow bands across the floor. The dust floating through it looked like tiny ghosts. She could hear them in every room, claiming, rearranging, renaming. Her life, once so full, was now a collection of tagged belongings. She reached into her pocket and took out an old photograph, its edges curled. It was Daniel at 10 years old, sitting on that same rocking chair, his small hands wrapped around a toy train she had saved for months to buy him. She remembered how his eyes had shone when he said, "Thank you, Mom." She pressed the photo flat against her knee, tracing his smile with her thumb. The noise of the present faded for a moment. Then Daniel's voice cut through. "Mother, we'll be starting renovations next week. It's better for you to stay in the guest house for now." She looked up slowly. "The guest house?" Clarissa chimed in, cheerful as ever. "It'll be quieter for you there. More privacy, and once we finish remodeling, you'll have a lovely little room downstairs. Very convenient." Margaret nodded once. "Convenient," she repeated. No one noticed the bitterness hiding in her calm. As they continued marking her life with bright stickers, she saw what they could not, how each note, each laugh, each claim was binding them to something far uglier than greed. It was blindness, the kind that grows from generations of taking without asking who paid the price. The clock in the hallway struck noon. The sound carried through the house, deep and steady. Margaret rose from the stair, her back straight despite the years that had bent it. "Enjoy your new home," she said softly, though no one seemed to hear. In her heart, she knew the truth. The house they were claiming was only made of wood and walls. The home they were destroying had lived inside her, and they would never find it, no matter how many stickers they placed on the furniture. She turned to Mary. "Leave the notes where they are," she said. "They'll make good reminders." Mary frowned. "Reminders of what?" Margaret looked toward the doorway, where the light from the afternoon sun framed the chaos of her family dividing her world. Her voice was steady when she answered, "Of what was never really theirs." The smell of bleach and damp towels clung to the air long after the sun went down. Somewhere upstairs, laughter burst like fireworks. Glasses clinked, chairs scraped, and music thumped through the floorboards as if the walls themselves were forced to dance. Margaret sat alone in the laundry room, the hum of the washing machine the only rhythm that belonged to her. The space was barely large enough for a folding chair and a table borrowed from the garden shed. A single light bulb flickered above her, casting the kind of shadow that made even air feel heavier. On the table rested a paper plate with a piece of cold chicken and a few potatoes that had turned gray around the edges. No one had asked if she wanted dinner. They had simply pointed her toward the back of the house and said it would be quieter there. She did not argue. Her fork scratched faintly against the paper plate as she forced herself to eat. The food was tasteless, but hunger had never been something she allowed to win. From the other room came the sound of Sophie's voice, high and cheerful. "To Dad's Empire," she called, and the others repeated it like a toast in a language Margaret no longer understood. "We're celebrating Dad's Empire," Clarissa added, her tone bright with champagne. Margaret lifted her eyes to the ceiling. The light from upstairs filtered through the slats in the vent, golden and moving, like memories she could never quite touch. She thought of the first meal she had ever cooked in this house, decades ago. The smell of roasted herbs, the warmth of Richard's hand on hers as they set the table together. He had been younger then, proud and tired, talking about ambition and future plans. They had eaten soup that night, the kind that took hours to make and minutes to disappear. She had always found comfort in soup. It was patient. It required time, care, and faith that something good could come from slow effort. Now, all that remained was this: a paper plate, a folding chair, a silence that mocked her. The door creaked open behind her. Mary stepped inside, her footsteps soft but sure. In her hands was a bowl of soup, steam curling from its surface. She set it gently on the table beside Margaret. "You shouldn't eat alone, ma'am," she said quietly. Margaret looked up. "They would not want me in their celebration." "They're not celebrating him," Mary replied. "They're celebrating what he left behind." For a moment, Margaret said nothing. Then she smiled faintly, a sad, knowing smile. "I built soup, Mary, and they built walls." Mary hesitated. "You built more than soup. You built all of this." Margaret shook her head. "No, I built the parts they no longer see, the patience, the quiet, the things that kept this house alive while they were too busy dreaming of empires." She lifted the spoon to her lips. The broth was warm, gentle against her tongue, carrying the faint taste of thyme and onion. It almost felt like forgiveness. "I remember," she said softly, "when Daniel was 5. He refused to eat his vegetables, so I hid them in the soup, He never noticed. He thought I had made magic. Mary smiled. You did, ma'am. You always did. Margaret's eyes grew distant. Magic only works if people still believe in it. Outside, wind brushed against the windows, scattering the sound of laughter through the halls. The contrast was cruel. Upstairs, they were dividing her life like it was a set of prizes. Down here, she was sitting among buckets, detergent, and ghosts. Her gaze wandered to the small square window above the sink. It was fogged from the cold, but she could still see the faint outline of the rose bushes Richard had planted along the driveway. Their petals had wilted under the frost. She wondered if anyone else had noticed. She finished the soup slowly, savoring each spoonful as if it were her last act of dignity for the night. When the bowl was empty, she folded her hands in her lap. The silence returned, but it no longer felt empty. It felt like space, something she might fill again one day. Mary began to collect the dishes, but Margaret stopped her. Leave it, she said softly. Let it stay warm a little longer. Mary nodded, sensing something unspoken in the air. She lingered by the doorway, her figure outlined by the faint light from the hallway. You know, ma'am, she said, sometimes people forget where the roots are. But roots don't forget, they just wait. Margaret looked up. You always speak in riddles, Mary. Because truth never likes to shout, Mary replied. It prefers to whisper. After Mary left, Margaret sat alone again. The sound of the washing machine faded. The house grew still except for the muted rhythm of footsteps above her head. She imagined them walking through rooms she had dusted, halls she had painted, carpets she had cleaned after Daniel's birthday parties. Every inch of the house carried her hands, but they treated it as if she had never been there at all. She stood slowly, her knees stiff from the cold, and moved toward the shelf where cleaning supplies were kept. Behind the bottles of bleach and fabric softener sat a small wooden box. She reached for it, brushing away the thin layer of dust. Inside was a set of photographs her and Richard in their early years, smiling in front of the house when it was still half-built. Their faces were young, filled with plans. She traced the edge of Richard's smile with her finger. You would hate this, she whispered. You would hate what they've become. Her voice echoed faintly against the tiled walls. She placed the photos back in the box and slid it behind the bottles again, as if hiding a secret part of herself from the chaos above. She turned off the light. The bulb went dark, leaving only the pale glow from the hallway. Her shadow stretched across the floor, long and thin, until it touched the bottom of the stairs. For a moment, she imagined it climbing, reaching up toward the rooms where her family laughed without her. Then she whispered to the darkness, You can keep the house. But I'll keep the truth. Outside, a storm was forming, though no one upstairs seemed to notice. The wind rattled the windows, and the roses bent low under the first drops of rain. Margaret sat back down, folded her hands, and waited. The sound of the rain grew stronger, mingling with the faint echo of her own heartbeat. She did not know it yet, but that night in the laundry room would be the last time she allowed them to decide where she belonged. The rain that tapped the windows of the laundry room carried her back to a different storm. Not the kind that bent the roses and rattled a tired house, but the kind that walks in on 2 feet and sits at your table with empty pockets and a voice that will not rise above a whisper. It was the winter of 2008. The market had fallen through itself like thin ice, and Richard came home with the cold still clinging to his coat. He did not take off his shoes. He did not kiss her cheek. He stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the hall and stared at the dark window as if it were a well with no bottom. They called, he said at last. The line of credit is gone. The merger is dead. By spring, we could lose it all. The soup on the stove ticked as bubbles found their way to the surface. Margaret ladled some into a bowl and set it in front of him. He did not touch it. The man who had once charmed rooms with a smile now looked like a photograph left in the sun too long, faded at the edges. Sit, she said. He sat. He put his head in his hands. In the lamp's low light, the veins in his wrists looked like blue strings pulled too tight. They will not follow me, he said quietly. Not now. They want a miracle I cannot give. Margaret listened to the clock. She listened to his breath. She listened to the house remember every debt they had ever paid on time. "What do they need to see?" she asked. "Security," he said. "Collateral, a bridge, and a plan for a future that does not yet exist." He could not see the plan, but she could. It was there between the soup and the window, written in the white space that appears when everything else has been crossed out. After he went to bed, she washed the bowl and set it back on the shelf. The kitchen grew quiet in that way kitchens do when they have done all they can for the day. She dried her hands on a towel and walked to the study. The key to the small safe was in a jar on the highest shelf. She had tucked it there when Daniel was little and liked to play pirate. The safe opened with a reluctant sigh. Inside lay a velvet roll that had belonged to her mother. Margaret untied the ribbon and unwrapped the bracelets, the rings, the necklace that had warmed with decades of celebrations. Gold remembers birthdays. Emerald remembers laughter. Diamonds remember the way a woman's breath catches when someone says she is beautiful. She held the wedding bangles to the lamplight. They were not heavy, yet they carried the weight of everything her mother had ever told her about love. Wear them in joy, wear them in worry. Do not take them off unless you must. Margaret pressed the cool metal against her wrist. Then she wrapped each piece in tissue and placed them in a small box. The box looked too plain for what it now contained, and perhaps that was fitting. Great value hides better when it looks ordinary. "Use it," she whispered to the quiet house. "But do not tell them it came from me." At the kitchen table, she spread out a stack of lined paper and took up a pen that always stained her middle finger with ink. The room smelled of thyme and lemon oil and the faint twinge of winter coming in through an old window. She began to write. She wrote a presentation that could be spoken in a single breath by a man who needed to look unafraid. She wrote a timeline that reassured anxious investors. She wrote a model that took the company's tired body and returned a spine to it. Expansion in phases anchored to reliable supply, partnerships that traded vanity for endurance. A public offering paced to the rhythm of what the market wanted to believe again. Her hand trembled at first. Then it steadied. The page filled. One sheet, then another, until a small stack leaned against the salt shaker. She drew a map of a future and labeled every turn so that anyone holding it would not lose their way. At 2 a.m, she stood and walked to the window. Snow had begun to fall, the kind that erases footprints and gives the street the mercy of a blank page. She breathed on the glass and traced a circle in the fog. In the circle, she drew a tiny square for the office and a tiny arrow pointing up. It was a foolish gesture, the sort a child might make, yet it steadied her. She read her pages one more time. She did not sign her name. She wrote another instead, a clean name, a quiet name, one that would not pull Richard into questions he did not want to answer. She placed the pages in a manila envelope and sealed it with the flat of her palm. In the morning, she would mail it to the office. No return address, no ribbon, only the sound of paper sliding into a slot and the soft thud of something important beginning. Before dawn, she dressed and took the box of jewelry to a small shop 2 towns over where the owner kept tissues behind the counter for women who changed their minds. Margaret did not cry. She stood very straight while the man weighed memory like it was grain, and when he told her the number, she nodded. The figure was enough to show the bank a bridge, enough to buy time, enough to turn a no into a not yet. By the time she returned, the house smelled of coffee. Richard sat at the table with his shoulders squared the way men do when they are practicing being brave. She poured him a cup and set the envelope on the chair beside his briefcase. "What is that?" he asked. "Something useful," she said. He slit the seal with a butter knife and began to read. Line by line, his face softened into focus. At the second page, his foot stopped tapping. At the third, he lifted his head and looked at her as if she had turned on a light. "Someone sent me brilliance," he said. He tried to make it a joke so he would not have to name the relief that had poured into his veins. "Even the handwriting looks familiar." "Then it must have come from a friend," she replied. He folded the pages carefully, as if any crease could change their meaning, and slid them into his case. He kissed the top of her head. The gesture belonged to a younger decade, yet it found its way back to them. That afternoon, the bank softened. The board agreed to hear him again. In the weeks that followed, numbers stopped falling long enough to be counted. By spring, new capital knocked like a welcome guest. On the day the company's future was announced, cameras flashed in a lobby that smelled of fresh paint. Richard spoke clearly, a man who had found his map in a blizzard and now dared others to follow it. Margaret watched the coverage from home. She was making soup. The headline on the screen read that the turnaround was a triumph of vision. There was a photograph of Richard shaking hands with men who enjoyed seeing themselves reflected in the glass doors. At the bottom ran a smaller line about a consultant whose ideas had clarified the path forward. No name appeared. It did not need to. She opened the drawer where she had once kept her mother's bangles. It looked too wide now, the way a mouth does after a tooth has been pulled. She pressed her fingers to the wood until the ache dulled. That night, Richard brought home a single white rose. He set it in a water glass on the table and said nothing. Gratitude is not always fluent. Sometimes it arrives as a flower that does not know where to stand. Eat, she told him, and he did. And for a while, that was enough. Years later, as she sat in the laundry room with the rain stitching the memory back together, Margaret realized the truest part of that winter was not the plan, not the money, not the quiet delivery of ideas to a man who needed them. The truest part was the feel of the bangles in her palm and the way her hand had steadied when the page asked her to be brave. She closed her eyes and pictured her mother fastening those circles of gold on her wrist on a morning filled with music and light. Wear them in joy, her mother had said. Wear them in worry. Do not take them off unless you must. Margaret had taken them off so that a future could be put on. No one upstairs would ever understand how loud that silence had been. She opened her eyes to the dim laundry room and the empty bowl Mary had left to keep her warm. She touched her wrist, felt the ghost weight where the bangles had once rested, and whispered to the quiet house that had held her secret for so long. I did not build an empire, she said. I built a bridge. And somewhere deep in the walls, the house seemed to listen. The article arrived folded into neat thirds, tucked into the morning paper, as if it were only another story in a world that never runs out of them. Margaret found it on the porch beside the milk, its glossy cover winking in the cold Vermont light. She carried it to the kitchen and set it on the table where so many small miracles had once been planned, with grocery lists and pencil stubs. On the cover, Richard looked younger than he had near the end. Cameras are generous in ways people are not. He stood in the atrium of the company headquarters, chin lifted, a silk tie catching the light. Above his shoulder, in letters that belonged on a monument, someone had chosen a headline that fit the mood of the investors and the appetite of the age. Legacy built alone. Margaret pressed her palm to the word alone until the ink warmed beneath her skin. She read the profile top to bottom. It spoke of strategy, resolve, the boldness to steer through a collapsing market, and the rare genius that can smell opportunity in smoke. It mentioned a turning point in 2008, a pivotal proposal that unlocked a path the board could follow without losing face. The writer praised the elegance of the plan and the firmness of the hand that carried it. Names filled the paragraphs like polished stones. None of them were hers. There was a photograph of the lobby plaque dedicated to ingenuity. The camera framed it perfectly so that any passerby might think innovation arrives fully formed in the minds of men already wearing the right suits. The caption credited Richard for vision and the firm for faith. She poured coffee and did not drink it. The steam lifted, then thinned into a pale ribbon before it vanished. Mary came in from the yard with a dusting of frost on her sleeves. She saw the magazine, saw the headline, and paused. "Do you want me to put that with the clippings, ma'am?" "Not with the others," Margaret said. "Give me a moment." When Mary left the room, Margaret read the article again, slower this time, as if a second reading might unlock the quiet paragraph where the author had hidden the rest of the truth. She found instead the familiar machinery of how stories are told when the world prefers a single face. She pictured rooms where decisions were made and voices echoing off polished wood. She imagined the table where her pages had been spread and relabeled. Contribution becomes consultation, partnership becomes support, intelligence becomes intuition. It is an old translation that travels quickly. And she wanted to be happy for him. She wanted to remember the rose he had brought home on the night the bank softened, and the way his hand had lifted when he found the courage to speak to cameras without stuttering. She wanted to be the woman who could watch him glow and feel full herself. But inside her, a hinge gave way. What opened was not bitterness, it was clarity. Silence is often praised as grace. Be still, be gentle, let the moment belong to the one who needs it. She had believed in that grace. She had practiced it the way a violinist practices scales, until her fingers knew the shape of it, without thought. But silence can harden into something else. It can be taken up by others and used to build a story that has room for every name but yours. She folded the magazine along the spine and smoothed it flat. Then she rose and walked to the old oak hutch that Richard had sanded by hand their first summer in the house. In the second drawer, behind the table linens, she kept a short stack of things that mattered and did not announce themselves. A letter about the patent filing, a photocopy of the bank memorandum, a photograph of her mother's wrists the day the bangles were clasped. She slid the magazine beneath them, as if it were an errand to be finished later. That evening, the house filled with company executives and their cheerful spouses. Toasts were made in the parlor, where the piano waited with its lid closed like a secret. Daniel spoke about growth and the next quarter, as if the future were a hallway already measured and marked with tape. Clarissa complimented the caterer on how cleanly the hors d'oeuvres came off their sticks. People admired the portrait of Richard that now hung where the family photograph had once been. Margaret moved through the rooms like a docent in a museum no one remembers to pay. She smiled when expected, shook hands that thanked her for the lovely home, and made sure the tray of tiny quiches never dropped below respectable. When someone asked where the idea for the turnaround had come from, she listened to the story she already knew and let it pass her like a train she was not meant to board. After the guests left and the dishwasher clicked into its steady hum, she returned to the kitchen. The night pressed against the windows, deep and blue. She took the magazine out again and stood under the overhead light. The headline glared, "Legacy Built Alone." She could hear the copywriter who had penned it, hear the rhythm, the clean finality of the phrase. It was good work, she thought. It sold a feeling people liked to buy. She folded the pages with care and slid them into the bottom drawer of the hutch. The wood swallowed them with a small sound. She closed the drawer and rested her fingertips on its edge, as if feeling for a pulse. "Silence is not always grace," she said quietly to the empty room. "Sometimes it is erasure." The word hung in the air longer than she expected. She tasted it like iron. She stood there a long time, measuring herself against the life she had chosen and the life that had been chosen for her. She remembered the way her hand had steadied the night she wrote the plan. She remembered the cold counter beneath the velvet roll that held her mother's jewelry. She remembered a younger self who thought love would translate effort without needing a translator. Mary's footsteps approached. She stopped at the threshold, respectful as always. "Can I bring you some tea before I turn in, ma'am?" "Chamomile," Margaret said. "Please." Mary brewed it and set the cup on the table, then lingered. "I saw the cover," she said at last. "It is a handsome picture." "He always did take a handsome picture," Margaret answered. She wrapped her hands around the cup for its heat. "Pictures are simple. They do not have to be complete to be convincing." Mary's gaze softened. "The people who need the whole picture will find it." "Perhaps," Margaret said, "but I am tired of waiting for people to need what I am." Mary left her with the tea and the quiet. The house settled, the way old houses do when all the doors are finally closed. The roses scraped faintly against the window in the wind. The clock in the hall counted what the night intended to keep. Margaret carried the cup to the sink once it had cooled, rinsed it, and set it upside down to dry. Then she walked to the mirror near the back door. The woman who looked back at her was not the one in the headline and not the one in the footnote. She was the space between, the place where work becomes worth even when no one is counting. She turned out the light and went to her room. In the dark, she could see the drawer in her mind, the magazine waiting under the stack of documents, the quiet weight of proof that did not ask for permission to exist. She would sleep, and in the morning, she would begin again to consider what silence should mean going forward. If you have ever built something in silence, leave a comment below. Your story matters too. They waited until afternoon, when the winter sun slanted low and made everything look easier than it was. Daniel walked through the upstairs hallway with a contractor's stride, tapping walls as if he were listening for weak spots. Clarissa kept pace beside him, phone in hand, the screen bright with sketches. Sophie and Ben lingered at the landing, whispering and laughing in the way of people who have already decided what they want from a place. Margaret stood in the doorway of her bedroom, one hand on the frame. The bedspread was smoothed tight, the way she had done it every morning. The scent of lavender sachets rose from the drawers each time the air moved. For a long minute, no one spoke. Then Daniel turned to her as if she were a task on a list. "Mother, it is practical. You do not need the upstairs. There are many ways to say you do not belong. This one chose the path of logic." Margaret's mouth formed the ghost of a smile. "Practical for whom, Daniel?" He did not answer. He had already shifted to the closet, calling over his shoulder. "Ben, bring the boxes. Clarissa, check the measurements for the built-ins. We should have the painters in by Thursday." Mary appeared at Margaret's side. She held a small stack of folded linens and the expression she used when children had to be told that the rain would last all day. "I can help you pack, ma'am," she said softly. "Not yet," Margaret replied. Daniel clapped his hands together lightly, a sound meant to move time forward. "We set up the room downstairs. It will be quieter, fewer stairs. You will be comfortable there." Clarissa's smile showed polished sympathy. "And when the remodel is done, you will have a lovely place near the garden. Think of the view." Margaret pictured the garden under snow, the rose canes tied back with twine, the wind dragging a brittle leaf along the stone path. She nodded as if the thought of a view had muscle enough to carry a life. They led her down the back staircase to the basement door. The light switch clicked and flickered. The bulb gave off a harsh, uneven glow that flattened everything it touched. The air smelled of bleach and damp concrete. A folding cot rested against the wall beside a rusted utility sink. On the card table, someone had set a pitcher of water, a chipped mug, and a stack of paper towels folded as if they were napkins. Daniel gestured as if unveiling a surprise. "See? Practical." Margaret ran a finger along the table's edge. Dust came away in a pale gray line. She thought of how many times she had cleaned a place just like this for other people to be comfortable. The symmetry of it made her want to laugh. Sophie peered in and wrinkled her nose. "It smells like a locker room." Ben nudged her and grinned. "We can get a diffuser." Clarissa touched Margaret's arm as if she were bestowing a kindness. "I will bring your things down in a bit. Only the essentials. Less clutter is better for you." Mary stepped past them and crossed to a small shelf near the cot. She set down the linens she carried, then reached into the pocket of her apron and drew out a photograph in a worn paper frame. She placed it on the table in front of Margaret, aligning it with care. The image had faded at the edges, but the light at its center was still strong. Margaret and Richard, young and fearless, stood in front of the brand new gate at Holloway Hill. Richard's arms circled her shoulders. Her smile was the kind that makes a stranger feel like a friend. The house behind them was smaller then, or perhaps it was simply less complicated. Mary's voice thinned. "They will never see you like this." Margaret kept her eyes on the photograph until the room stopped spinning around it. When she finally looked up, her face was calm, the way a lake is calm right before it breaks into waves. "Then I will let them see what they missed." Daniel cleared his throat. "We will give you a moment to settle." He looked relieved to be excused from emotion. "Dinner at 7. They left in a small clatter of purposeful footsteps. Their voices rose on the stairs, bright with plans about paint swatches and timelines. The basement light hummed. Dust drifted in the beam like pollen that had lost its way. Somewhere a pipe clicked in the walls, counting off the seconds. Mary turned to Margaret. "What do you need?" "Only the lamp," Margaret said. "And a moment without witnesses." Mary nodded and went to find a lamp. When she returned, she placed it on the table and tested the switch until a kinder light arrived. Then she hesitated. "Shall I stay?" "Not now," Margaret answered. "Thank you." When the door at the top of the stairs closed, Margaret stood very still and listened to the silence settle. She measured the room the way a carpenter measures wood, not for what it is, but for what it could bear. The concrete floor held a faint pattern of hairline cracks like a map to a place where no one goes. She crossed to the far corner where the utility shelves met the wall and knelt. The cold seeped through her skirt and into her knees. There was a floorboard here that did not match the others. Years ago, when a leak had warped the original plank, Richard had replaced it with whatever scrap he had on hand. The grain ran against the room the way a river sometimes refuses to follow the valley. Margaret slipped her fingernails into the narrow seam and lifted. The board rose with a sound like an old book opening. Beneath it lay a cavity wrapped in darkness and dust. She reached inside and felt for the leather. The folder was where she had left it, warm only because she had remembered it so often. She drew it out and laid it on the table. The brown leather was worn at the corners, burnished by touch, marked by years of being the one true thing she allowed herself to keep. She opened it. Inside were the documents that bore her name in ink that had not faded. The joint trust certificate, the memorandum from the bank acknowledging the deposit that arrived at the exact hour the company needed breath. Notes from late nights and early mornings, her tidy script marching across the page with the quiet certainty of a person who no longer asks permission to be clear. She traced her signature with the tip of one finger. It was a small thing, that line of ink, and yet it was the most honest mirror she owned. From upstairs came the faint thud of a chair being moved. Someone laughed, someone else shushed them. Margaret turned a page and found the outline of the plan she had written at the kitchen table all those years ago. The paper still smelled faintly of lemon oil from the hutch where it had slept, and of the ink that had stained her middle finger the night she dared to put a future into sentences. Mary opened the door quietly and slipped back inside with a wool blanket. "It gets cold down here," she said, tucking it over the cot. Her gaze fell to the folder. For the first time that day, her shoulders loosened. "Good," she whispered. "You kept it safe." Margaret looked up. "We did," she said. "The house did." Mary's eyes shone. "What will you do now?" Margaret closed the folder and rested her palms upon it as if taking an oath. "I will stop being practical," she said. "I will be precise." Mary nodded as if a verdict had been reached. "I will make tea." When she was alone again, Margaret lifted the photograph from the table and set it beside the folder. Her younger self smiled from the gate, careless and bright. The woman in the basement met that smile with a steadier one. She was not that girl anymore. She was something narrower and stronger, like a beam that has carried a roof through winter after winter and learned to trust its own grain. The bulb flickered, and for a heartbeat, the room went dark. When the light returned, nothing had changed except the part of her that had finally stood up. She slid the floorboard back into place and pressed it flat with her palm. Then she gathered the folder to her chest and sat on the cot with the blanket pulled over her knees. Above her, the house walked around in borrowed confidence. Down here, the truth waited on the table, patient as an old friend. Margaret watched the thin breath of steam rise from the lamp's warm shade and thought of the first page she would copy, the first call she would make, the first word she would speak that did not apologize for existing. They had given her the basement. She had taken back the ground. The next morning, the sky over Holloway Hill looked bruised. A pale wind scraped across the fields, carrying the smell of snow and wood smoke. Margaret stood at the edge of the driveway, her coat buttoned to the chin, the folder of papers hidden beneath her arm. She could feel the cold trying to steal its way through the seams of her gloves, but the pulse in her wrist kept time with her steps. She began to walk. The road from the estate to the town curved through long stretches of bare trees, their branches arched over her like bones, whispering as she passed. Cars roared by from time to time, the drivers glancing at her, a gray-haired woman walking through winter with purpose too steady to look lost. Her boots crunched over patches of frozen mud. She had once driven this way hundreds of times beside Richard, watching him gesture out the window as he rehearsed speeches and ideas. Now it was her turn to speak, though no one yet knew it. The sign for Whitaker Row Attorneys rose ahead, black letters faded by years of wind. The building stood behind it, a square of brick trimmed with white shutters. Margaret paused at the gate, gathering her breath. The snow began to fall, slow at first, as if to give her time. She pushed open the door and stepped inside. The office smelled of paper, ink, and old wood polished too often. The receptionist, a young woman with bright eyes, looked up. "Can I help you?" "I would like to see Mr. Whitaker," Margaret said. "Do you have an appointment?" "Tell him it's Margaret Holloway," she replied. "Richard's wife." The woman blinked, then nodded. "One moment, ma'am." She disappeared down the hallway, her heels tapping a rhythm of curiosity. Margaret waited beside a small table covered in legal journals. A framed diploma hung above a radiator that clicked with heat. She remembered sitting in this very office years ago beside Richard, listening to Mr. Whitaker explain clauses and contingencies she had already understood before he spoke. A door opened. Mr. Whitaker appeared, older now, his hair gone silver at the temples, but his posture still sharp. His expression softened when he saw her. "Mrs. Holloway," he said, "it has been too long. Please, come in." She followed him into a room lined with bookcases and thick curtains. He gestured toward a chair near the fireplace. "I heard about Richard. I'm sorry." She nodded once, her hands tightening around the folder. "He left behind more than sorrow, Mr. Whitaker. I need to show you something." He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing slightly as she placed the folder on the desk. The leather made a quiet sigh as it opened. Inside were the papers she had kept hidden for nearly 2 decades. Deeds, bank memorandums, handwritten proposals, all arranged with the precision of someone who had prepared for this moment far longer than she had admitted to herself. Mr. Whitaker adjusted his glasses and began to read. With each page, his face changed. His brows lifted, his jaw set, and finally he looked up. "You were the architect behind it all," he said. Margaret's voice was steady. "No, just the quiet engineer." He sat back, the paper still in his hands. "You understand what this means, don't you? Your name is on the founding documents. You hold co-ownership of the trust and intellectual property rights tied to the initial public offering. It was never transferred out of your claim." "I understand." He hesitated, studying her face. "And you kept this to yourself all these years?" "Yes." "Why now?" Margaret took a slow breath. "Because silence can be mistaken for absence, and I am still here." Whitaker regarded her with something between admiration and grief. "We will need to verify the documents," he said finally. "But if these are what they appear to be, you have every right to reclaim your share and your authorship." She nodded. "Do what you must." He picked up the proposal written in her old cursive. "This one," he said, tapping the page. "You wrote this by hand?" "I did." "I will call a handwriting analyst, someone I trust completely." Within an hour, a specialist arrived from Burlington, a woman named Dr. Levine, with careful eyes and the kind of patience born from studying details most people never see. She set up her instruments on the desk, magnifying glass and ultraviolet light, and compared the samples Mr. Whitaker provided from old bank checks and letters. The office grew silent except for the faint crackle of the fire. Margaret watched her work. Every loop of ink, every curve of pressure, felt like a heartbeat resurfacing from the past. It was strange to see her own handwriting treated as evidence. She thought of the night she had written those lines, her hand trembling over the page, unaware that each word would one day need to defend itself. After nearly 2 hours, Dr. Levine lifted her head. "It is a perfect match," she said. "Same pressure patterns, same character spacing, same hesitation points. 100% identical." Mr. Whitaker exhaled. "Then it is yours." He turned to Margaret, his voice softer now. "Do you wish to pursue a claim? We can file for formal recognition, asset retrieval, intellectual ownership. You could easily—" She stopped him with a raised hand. "I do not want revenge." He nodded slowly. "Then what do you want?" Her answer came without pause. "Recognition." The word seemed to settle the air around them. Not power, not restitution, just acknowledgement. Mr. Whitaker folded his hands. "That, Mrs. Holloway, is something the law can give, but it will take courage to accept it." "I have lived through smaller courages," she said. He smiled faintly. "Then let us begin." They worked until dusk, sorting the papers into new folders stamped with fresh dates. He photocopied signatures, notarized affidavits, and sent formal inquiries to the patent office. The rhythm of the work soothed her. It was the language she had always spoken: best quiet order, steady precision, truth built one line at a time. When it was done, Whitaker closed the final folder and looked at her across the desk. "You will hear from me within a week," he said. "If the registration holds as I believe it will, the record will show your authorship officially. Richard's company would not exist without you." Margaret rose, the folder lighter now in her hands, though its meaning had grown heavier. She extended her hand. "Thank you for remembering how to listen." Outside, the snow had thickened. The air bit at her cheeks, but her stride was sure. Streetlights came on, small halos of yellow against the dusk. She walked past the bakery where she and Richard used to stop for apple turnovers on Fridays, past the church whose bells had tolled for his funeral. Each step felt like a quiet return to herself. When she reached the corner, she stopped beneath the lamplight. The wind lifted her hair and carried her breath away in a cloud of white. She thought of the folder now safe in Whitaker's office, the proof that she had never been invisible, only patient. In that still moment, she realized that history could be rewritten, not with fury, but with fact. She turned toward home, the snow crunching underfoot. The house at Holloway Hill would still be filled with laughter she could not share, but soon it would hold something truer than that. It would hold her name again. If you believe women's voices deserve to be remembered, not rewritten, subscribe and stay with us. The stories of women like Margaret are not whispers of the past. They are the blueprints of resilience still being built today. Rain traced slow lines down the glass, as if the sky itself had decided to keep a record. Mr. Whitaker's conference room was all clean angles and dark wood, the kind of place where truth looks heavier once it is spoken aloud. Margaret sat at the end of the table, hands folded, wedding locket cool against her collarbone. Across from her, Daniel leaned back in his chair with the careless grace of a man who expects the world to arrive on a tray. Sophie scrolled through her phone. Ben practiced a signature in the margin of a brochure. Clarissa adjusted her silk scarf and offered the room a smile that pretended to be kind. The receptionist closed the door and the room stilled. Mr. Whitaker entered with a leather case and a stack of folders. He greeted everyone, not warmly and not coldly, simply as one greets a storm that has already begun. He took his place at the head of the table and opened a file. "Thank you for coming," he said. "We are here to execute the final wishes of the late Richard Holloway." Daniel exhaled through his nose, a sound that tried to be a laugh and failed. "Let us be efficient," he said. He glanced at Margaret as if she were an afterthought. His voice dropped to a whisper that was designed to be overheard. "She'll be gone before next Christmas." Sophie covered a smile. Ben smirked without looking up. Mr. Whitaker did not sit. He reached into his case and placed a small recorder on the table. The room seemed to lean toward it. He clicked a button. Static rustled, then a voice filled the space. Margaret closed her eyes. "Richard," slower than she remembered, but clear. "If my son ever speaks ill of his mother, deduct $1 million per word." Silence did not fall so much as it arrived, tall and complete. The rain tapped once, twice, and even that sound felt too loud. Daniel's face drained of color. His mouth opened and then closed again, the way a man tries to catch a glass after it has hit the floor. He looked at Mr. Whitaker. "What is this supposed to be?" "An addendum," Whitaker said, his tone professional as a sealed envelope. "Legally recorded, dated 3 days after the funeral." Clarissa found her voice first. "This is absurd. You cannot possibly quantify something like that." Whitaker did not look at her. He lifted another folder. A transcript from the home security system, selected statements made in this house in the presence of Mrs. Holloway. He turned one page, then another. The tally is meticulous. He slid a sheet across the table toward Daniel. A list of sentences stared up like a ledger of small knives. You could practically hear the echoes of each insult. The total was not the point. The point was that there had been a count at all. Daniel pushed the paper away. "He would never have done this." "He did," Whitaker replied. "He signed it. I witnessed it." The rain deepened against the glass. Somewhere in the hall, a phone rang and was quickly silenced. Margaret kept her eyes on the recorder. It sat like a small, patient clock, measuring what apology could not buy. Whitaker closed the addendum and opened a new file. Now to the will itself. There are specific bequests which we will detail later. But first, the matter of the trust and the primary beneficiary. Clarissa straightened, already preparing a nod that would look modest. Sophie sat up. Ben capped his pen. Whitaker looked down at the page, then back up at the room. Richard Holloway leaves the trust, the controlling interest in Holloway Industries, and all associated intellectual property rights to his wife, Margaret Holloway. No one moved. The statement did not echo. It simply became air. Daniel spoke at last, as if the word had cut his tongue on its way out. "What intellectual property?" Whitaker folded his hands. "The strategy and model that saved this company during the financial crisis. The proposal that guided the public offering and restructured supply and growth. Its authorship is documented." He set a photocopy in front of Daniel and another in front of Clarissa. The handwriting looked back at them with a calm that had taken years to learn. Margaret felt her pulse in her wrists. Not fear. Arrival. "Who wrote this?" Sophie asked, eyes narrowing. Whitaker did not answer her. He addressed the room. "A handwriting analysis was performed last week against verified samples." The match was complete. He turned to Margaret and inclined his head. "Mrs. Holloway is the author." The word author seemed to ripple through the table. Ownership is a simple word. It is also a door that closes behind you once you step through it. Daniel's chair scraped. "This is a stunt." "It is a record," Whitaker said. "And there is one more." He opened a smaller envelope and removed a letter, pages creased in careful thirds. He did not hand it to anyone. He read, "My dear Margaret, you built this empire with me. Let them never erase your name again." The paper shook slightly in Whitaker's hands. He steadied it. Signed, Richard Holloway. Margaret felt the room tilt and then right itself. She had not expected the exact words she needed to hear. She did not want forgiveness. She wanted the truth to stand up where everyone could see it. The letter did not give her back the bangles or the young morning when she had first believed a house could keep a promise. It gave her something else, witness. Ben broke the quiet. "So what now? She just takes everything." Whitaker replied without heat. "She receives what is hers. The trust recognizes her co-founder status. The patents and associated royalties are recorded in her name. The will designates her as primary beneficiary. The addendum adjusts certain distributions in light of conduct." He did not look at Daniel when he said it. He did not need to. Daniel leaned forward, both hands on the table. "Mother, you cannot mean to enforce this." Margaret turned her head. His face was the face she had memorized as a child's, the one she had held against her shoulder in the middle of the night while Storms learned his name. Now it belonged to a man who had forgotten the cost of comfort. "I do not mean to break you," she said quietly. "I mean to stop disappearing." No one spoke. The clock on the wall clicked. The rain softened to a hush like breath. Whitaker cleared his throat. "There are practical matters to attend to, deeds to transfer, accounts to consolidate. We will schedule times for signatures." He gathered the folders and aligned their corners, an old habit that made order look simple. Margaret stood. Her chair made almost no sound. She reached for the locket at her collar and pressed it once, lightly, as if testing a bell. She looked at Whitaker. "Thank you." He nodded. "It is the law that thanks you. I only held it still long enough to be useful." Daniel tried one last time, the way a person throws words at a tide. "You cannot do this to family." Margaret met his eyes. "I did not. You did it to yourself." The wind rose and the building creaked. Somewhere beyond the glass, the town went on with its errands. Margaret picked up her coat. The fabric had been called dull once, an old beige that did not flatter photographs. Today, it felt like a color that did not ask permission to belong. As she reached the door, Whitaker spoke again. "There is a copy of the letter for you," he said. He slid a second envelope across the table toward her. She took it and felt the weight of Richard's handwriting within. Outside, the rain fell in a clean sheet. She stepped into it and it did not feel cold. It felt like the sound of a name being said correctly after years of being misplaced. She lifted her face to the weather and let the drops find her skin. Then she walked toward the street, the recorder's final echo still settling in the room behind her, the line that had begun in a kitchen at 2 a.m. finally reaching its period. The sky over Holloway Hill opened into a bruised gold the morning the trucks arrived. Tires groaned against the gravel driveway, and for the first time in years, the great house looked awake. Boxes were stacked by the front door, labeled in neat black marker. Personal items, kitchenware, miscellaneous. Daniel's voice rose through the open windows, sharp at first, then cracked by exhaustion. They were leaving. Margaret watched from the garden gate. The air was heavy with the scent of rain-soaked cedar and wet earth. She had dreamed of this moment many times, though never with triumph. It felt quieter, sadder, like watching the tide erase footprints you had once loved. Daniel stepped out of the house carrying a final box. His suit jacket hung loose on his shoulders, his tie crooked. The man who had once filled a room with certainty now moved like someone trying not to disturb the air around him. He set the box down by the truck and turned. Their eyes met for the first time in days. "I didn't know, Mom," he said. The words stumbled, half broken. "I didn't know it was you." She studied his face. Behind the fatigue, she could still see the boy who used to press his palm against the window when she left for errands, the one who needed lullabies longer than his sister ever did. And it hurt to see that boy hiding in the ruins of his own ambition. "You spoke first," she said softly. The will only listened. He closed his eyes. "I was cruel." "You were careless," she replied. "Cruelty takes intent. You simply never thought to look at the hands that built what you stood on." Daniel looked down at his shoes, at the puddles forming on the cobblestones. "I thought Dad did it all alone." "That is what the world taught you to believe," she said, "and perhaps I helped that story by staying silent." A sound escaped him, half sigh, half sob. He turned toward the truck, his shoulders shaking. Margaret wanted to reach for him, but her hand stayed still. Love, she had learned, does not always mean rescue. Sometimes it means letting someone stand in the weight of their own understanding. Clarissa came out next, sunglasses hiding her eyes though there was no sun. She carried a box marked Decor and refused to look Margaret's way. Behind her, Sophie dragged a suitcase across the steps. Ben followed, silent for once, earbuds gone. None of them spoke. The house seemed to listen to their retreat the way an old friend listens to goodbyes that come too late. When the trucks finally pulled away, the gravel settled into silence. Margaret stood on the porch, the wind lifting her gray hair from her face. She had expected to feel something like victory. What came instead was release, a soft, weightless quiet, like the exhale of a bird finally landing. Inside, the house smelled faintly of lemon oil and old paper. She walked through the hallway, her shoes tapping against the wooden floor. Each room looked larger now, stripped of its noise. The living room still held echoes of laughter, sharp as glass. She paused at the mantel where her family's portrait had once hung. Only the nail remained, small and rusted, like a scar left on purpose. Then she saw it. A single neon green sticky note clinging to the armchair by the window. "This one's mine." She reached out and peeled it slowly, the paper coming away with a soft whisper. "Not anymore," she murmured. In the kitchen, another sticker waited on the sideboard. She removed it. "Not anymore." On the mirror by the stairs. "Not anymore." On the piano, where her husband's reflection had once smiled back at her. "Not anymore." She moved from room to room, collecting the remnants of other people's claims. By the time she reached the dining room, her hands were full of colored squares, blue, yellow, pink, green, a confetti of misplaced ownership. She dropped them into the fireplace. The flame caught quickly, curling the edges, erasing what had once been written so confidently. The ash rose, gray and light, and drifted toward the chimney. Margaret turned toward the window. Outside, the rosebush stood where it always had, the same one Richard had planted years ago, its stems brittle from neglect. She stepped into the garden and knelt beside it. The soil was dry, cracking at the surface. She fetched the old watering can from beside the shed and filled it from the hose. The metal was cold in her hands, but when she poured, the water fell warm against the earth. The smell rose immediately, damp soil and memory. She tilted the can until every drop was gone. The last trickle caught a ray of late sunlight, glinting like gold across the petals. "Live again," she whispered. A breeze stirred the branches. One soft leaf trembled, alive against the dying light. She stayed there until the first stars appeared, until the house behind her no longer felt like a cage, but something returned to her care. When she stood, her knees ached, but her spine was straight. The windows reflected the sky, and for a moment she saw herself there, not the woman in mourning, not the ghost of the estate, but the architect of her own peace. She went back inside and climbed the stairs. In her bedroom, the one Daniel had wanted for himself, she opened the window to let the night air in. The scent of the revived roses followed. On the dresser sat the letter from Richard. She unfolded it once more, tracing the familiar loops of his handwriting. "You built this empire with me. Let them never erase your name again." She smiled, a quiet, private curve of the lips that carried both grief and grace. Downstairs, the clock chimed 7. The house, for the first time in years, felt honest. Every tick was a reminder that time could still belong to her. She returned to the garden one last time before bed. The moonlight had settled across the petals, making them gleam pale pink. She touched the edge of a bloom and felt the faint pulse of life beneath it. Tomorrow she would call the foundation board, the one she had formed in her mind years ago but never dared to name. It would be for women like her, those written out of the pages they helped create. But tonight, she let herself simply be a woman in her own house, surrounded by air that no longer carried anyone else's claim. She turned back toward the door, the hem of her dress brushing the wet grass. The world behind her had changed, though no one else would ever see the moment it happened. Inside, the hall light glowed soft and golden. Margaret closed the door and whispered to the quiet, "This one's mine." Outside, the roses swayed gently in the wind, drinking from the earth she had chosen to water again. Spring came late to Vermont that year. The snow melted reluctantly, leaving behind a field of mud that smelled of beginnings. Margaret stood at the front gate of Holloway Hill one last time, the wind pulling gently at her coat. The house loomed behind her, stately and silent, stripped of noise and false laughter. The rose bushes were blooming again. Their petals caught the early light, soft as a sigh. The sale had gone through that morning. Mr. Whitaker had handled the papers with his usual calm precision, And now the house belonged to another family, a young couple with 2 children and a golden retriever that barked at its own reflection in the windows. Margaret had watched the children run through the hallways and felt something loosen in her chest. Homes, she decided, were meant to be lived in, not worshipped. When the moving van closed its doors, she climbed into the waiting taxi with 1 suitcase and the brown leather folder resting on her lap. Inside it were copies of the court's final recognition of her authorship and the first documents of her new creation, the Silent Builders Fund. She had spent the last month setting it up quietly, the way she once saved a company without anyone noticing. The fund was small at first, but steady, seeded with royalties from the patent and her share of the trust. Its purpose was simple: to offer scholarships and grants to women whose ideas had been dismissed, stolen, or forgotten. It would exist for those who had built and been erased. When the taxi turned north toward Maine, she looked out the window at the passing hills. Each mile felt lighter. She did not leave with bitterness. She left with a blueprint for peace. Her new home sat on the edge of Portland, a small apartment overlooking the Atlantic. The building was old brick, the kind that caught salt in its seams and smelled faintly of tidewater. The sea stretched out beyond the window, blue and wide and mercifully endless. The movers placed her few belongings in tidy stacks. There was no grandeur here, only clean light, quiet air, and the hum of gulls circling the docks. On the mantel above the fireplace, she set the wooden plaque she had brought from Vermont. The words were carved deep, each letter brushed with gold paint she had mixed herself in the kitchen. This home was funded by a burden and built by a woman who remembered. She ran her fingers over the grooves. Memory, she thought, was not a chain to be broken, but a bridge to be crossed. Later that evening, as the sun lowered into the water, Margaret unpacked a small tin box of mementos. Inside were only 2 things. The first was a faded photograph of her and Richard standing before Holloway Hill on the day it was finished. The second was a child's drawing, wrinkled and smudged, once taped to the old refrigerator. In thick purple crayon, the words read, "Grandma thinks better than Google." Ben had drawn it when he was 6, long before he learned how to mock what he did not understand. The stick figure of her wore large glasses and stood beside a glowing light bulb. The picture made her laugh, soft and deep. She smoothed the paper flat and placed it on her new refrigerator door, right in the center. As night fell, she sat by the window with a cup of tea and watched the tide roll in. The sound of the sea was steady, almost like breathing. It filled the quiet in a way that no voices ever could. She thought of all the women who had sat in silence across generations, women who had written, sewn, drawn, planned, calculated, and kept families or fortunes alive without ever signing their names. They were the invisible engineers of history, their brilliance wrapped in patience, their ideas hidden in the margins of other people's success. The fund she had created was for them, for every mother who whispered ideas into a husband's ear, for every daughter who was told her mind was too sharp for comfort, for every widow who built again from ruins. She imagined the letters that would one day arrive at her post office box, stories of women in small towns and big cities, from Maine to Montana, writing to say they had received a grant, that someone finally believed them. It made her chest ache in the best possible way. Margaret leaned back in her chair. The waves struck the rocks below with a rhythm she could have mistaken for applause. She thought of what Richard had written in his last letter. "Let them never erase your name again." For years she had mourned the version of him who had taken too much and spoken too little. But now she could see what he had left behind. A chance for her to be seen, not as the wife of a man who built an empire, but as the woman who had built its bones. The clock ticked softly in the corner. The sea breeze carried the scent of salt and lilac through the open window. Margaret looked around the small apartment, its quiet, its simplicity, its truth, and smiled. "They called me fading," she said aloud, her voice almost playful. "I was just waiting to think out loud." Her laughter filled the room, light and steady. Outside, a gull swept past the window and vanished into the pale horizon. Inside, Margaret reached for a notebook and began to write the first entry in what she called the Journal of the Silent Builders. She wrote not for fame, but for continuity, for every woman who had once believed her own story was too small to matter. When she finished, she turned off the light and watched the sea turn silver under the moon. The wooden plaque on the wall caught the faint glow, the words shimmering as if alive. If this story moved you, share it for every woman who ever built in silence. Because silence may be golden, but truth is priceless. Epilogue. Speak your own story. In the quiet of her seaside apartment, Margaret Holloway's story came full circle. What began as silence ended as a voice steady, clear, and unafraid. Her life had once been measured in the shadows of others, but now it stood in its own light, proof that dignity can bloom even after decades of being dismissed. She did not seek revenge. She built remembrance. She did not crave power. She built purpose. And in doing so, she became something greater than forgotten. She became a guardian for all who had been unseen. Every life holds a story like hers, somewhere between grief and grace, waiting for the courage to be told aloud. Maybe yours does too. Maybe you have built quietly, sacrificed quietly, loved quietly, and wondered if anyone noticed. They do now. If Margaret's journey touched you, let it remind you that your voice matters. Tell your story before someone else writes it for you. Share this video so another woman somewhere remembers that she still has time to begin again. Like this video if you believe that strength grows in silence, and subscribe to Grandma's Final Chapter to hear more true stories of resilience, hope, and the unbreakable beauty of the human spirit. Because every story deserves to be heard, and every forgotten builder deserves to be remembered.